He spent 12 years making sure the ball never got past him. Now his job is making sure nothing gets past you either. This is the story of how one of the best defenders England has ever produced walked away from the only life he'd ever known, lost the thing that mattered more than football, and rebuilt himself into one of the most powerful voices in the sport. Not a pundit who got lucky, a guy who studied the transition like it was a Champions League final. Stick around, because the second half of this story is honestly more interesting than the first. Rio Ferdinand grew up in Peckham, South London, and came through West Ham United's academy, the same production line that gave us Frank Lampard and Joe Cole. He made his first team debut in 1996, still a teenager, and almost immediately, people around the club were saying the same thing. This kid doesn't defend like a defender, he defends like a footballer. He read the game early. He was comfortable on the ball when most centre-backs were just trying to hoof it into row Z, and clubs noticed fast. In the year 2000, Leeds United paid West Ham £18 million for him. At the time, that made Rio Ferdinand the most expensive defender on the planet. 2 years later, it happened again. Manchester United came calling in 2002, broke the British transfer record a second time, and paid £30 million to bring him to Old Trafford. What followed were 12 years that turned him into a legend. Alongside Nemanja Vidic, he formed one of the most feared defensive partnerships English football has ever seen. 6 Premier League titles, a Champions League, 81 caps for England across 3 World Cups. By any measure, this was a career most players only dream about. And then, in March of 2015, it just ended. His final club was Queen's Park Rangers, not Old Trafford, not Wembley. A relatively quiet exit for a player who'd spent over a decade at the very top. And here's the thing most highlight reels skip over. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this kind of story, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making these. Alright, back to the story. That same year, Ferdinand lost his wife Rebecca to breast cancer. She was 34. They had 3 young children together. Think about that timeline for a second. In the space of a few months, the 2 biggest pillars of his entire adult life, football and his family as he knew it, both changed forever. Most people, understandably, would have disappeared from public life completely. Rio didn't, but he wasn't the same man who walked off that pitch either. In interviews since, he's been open about it. He said the loss forced him to slow down and look at who he'd actually become during his playing days. A man who, in his own words, put football first and let everything else slot in behind it. That reckoning is the real hinge point of this story. Because the version of Rio Ferdinand who stepped in front of a camera as a broadcaster wasn't just a retired footballer looking for a paycheck. He was a man who had been rebuilt by something much bigger than the game. Not long after retiring, Ferdinand signed on with BT Sport, which years later would become TNT Sports, as a football pundit. And let's be honest about something. The jump from professional athlete to broadcaster looks easy from the outside. It is not. Plenty of great players have sat in that chair and been genuinely uncomfortable in front of a camera. Reading the game and explaining the game, live, under pressure, in real time, that's a completely different skill. Ferdinand treated it like a second apprenticeship. He got sharper, more comfortable, more willing to actually say what he thought instead of playing it safe. By 2019, he'd become one of the most quotable voices in the business, memorably declaring that Manchester United should pay their interim manager, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, quote, whatever he wants, after a stunning Champions League comeback against PSG. That's not the safe pundit answer. That's a man with an opinion, unafraid to give it. He spent a full decade in that chair, every week, every Champions League night, for 10 years straight. But here's where the story actually gets interesting, because being a TV pundit was never the finish line for Rio Ferdinand, it was the training ground. Alongside his television work, Ferdinand built something of his own, a YouTube show called Vibe with 5, filmed with 2 co-hosts, Joe Bea and Stephen Howson, out of a studio in South London. And unlike the polished, tightly scripted world of live TV, this was raw, reactive, fast, the kind of content football fans were already creating in group chats, except now it had Rio Ferdinand sitting at the table. And that's when the real shift happened. Ferdinand stopped just talking about players from a studio desk and started sitting down with them directly. He interviewed Steven Gerrard before Gerrard left for LA Galaxy. He's brought in Jermaine Defoe, Willian, Vincent Kompany, Wood van Nistelrooy, even former Manchester United Academy talent Ravel Morrison for a raw, honest conversation about what really happened to his career. And here's what makes those conversations hit different. He's not a journalist who studied football from the outside looking in. He was in those dressing rooms. He knows exactly which question a player will actually answer honestly and which one will get the polished, media-trained non-answer. That's not something you can train a broadcaster to do. That's 12 years in the Premier League translated into an interviewing instinct. Then, in the summer of 2025, Ferdinand did something that surprised a lot of people. After 10 years, he walked away from TNT Sports. His final broadcast was the Champions League final between Paris Saint-Germain and Inter Milan. In his own statement, he called it a difficult decision, one made to focus on his growing media business and on spending more time with his family. Because by this point, Vibe with 5 had grown into something much bigger, a full production company under the banner Rio Ferdinand Presents, covering interviews, documentaries, vlogs, and reactions, built entirely on his own terms, with no network executive deciding what he could and couldn't say. He'd also relocated to Dubai with his family, describing the city's mindset as fuel for exactly this kind of reinvention. And when you step back and look at the full arc of it, academy kid, record transfer, Premier League legend, grieving husband, TV pundit, and now independent media owner, you realize something. Rio Ferdinand didn't just have one career, he's had at least three. And he approached every single one of them the same way he approached defending. Study the game, read what's coming, get there before everyone else does. Most retired athletes struggle to find a second act. Rio Ferdinand built an entire second career out of asking better questions than the people who used to ask him. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe, because we're breaking down more stories just like this one every single week.